right, so I have another question for you. It's my favorite chapter, chapter 18, the three gateways to paradise, the law of desire and surrender. The first quote is, things that resonate at the same frequency attract each other, on page 218. I love that idea of like attracts like. The second quote from that chapter, resonance is a unique property of waves and is the second most powerful principle in the cosmos, right after balance, with which it is intimately related. And the third quote from that chapter is, within ecstasy is a drop of bliss. Within bliss is a drop of ecstasy. And within equanimity is a drop of both.
Wow. Yeah, you know, to hear you read that, it's humbling because it's so profound. That those three quotes are actually very profound. That, to understand resonance, you first really have to understand waves. And what is a wave? It's something that goes back and forth like a pendulum, swings back and forth. So it repeats itself. And if we were to graph a wave, it looks like a sine wave. In the book, I have a drawing, an illustration of taking a pendulum that's swinging back and forth. Let's do it this way, swinging back and forth. And then if you imagine there was a little pencil at the bottom of it, and you ran a piece of paper underneath it at a constant speed, then if you looked at that paper, you'd see a wave, okay? And so the wave, anything that waves, is like a pendulum seeking balance. That's what a pendulum does in the gravitational field. It swings towards the balance point, overshoots it, and then goes, oops, we got to go back. And then overshoots it like that. So that is balance, and the whole cosmos functions in terms of balance, right? So human life is really an intermediary between sunlight, which is hot, like the surface of the sun, and coldness. There's a thermal flow of energy from the sun, which is very hot, into a universe that is really very cold. And that heat is trying to find a thermal equilibrium. So you have this wave pattern, and that wave represents the attempt to find balance. And the biggest balancing act in the cosmos is thermal, hot temperatures trying to reach a thermal equilibrium. So you have the surface of the sun, which is extraordinarily hot, radiating heat into the cold cosmos. And human life is inserted in between, which makes us, we take some of that solar energy through the foods we eat that's stored in the plants and the animals. We eat those foodstuffs. We're actually taking that thermal energy and we're transforming it into our lives. And all living creatures do this. So this is a fundamental principle of nature. If you take a hot spoon and you put it into a glass of cooler water, the spoon gets cooler and the water gets hotter. And in a very short period of time, they reach thermal equilibrium. Equa means balance, equal balance. And the whole universe runs like that. Okay, so that's a wave. The frequency at which this pendulum swings back and forth, or the crests and the troughs of the wave occur, that frequency is very specific to different systems. You can think of taking a swing, like you push a child on a swing. Every swing, depending on how long the chains are to the, where the person sits, has its own type of frequency because it has its own kind of wavelength. This is, basic kind of physics. So what happens with resonance is when you have two waves that are waving at the same frequency, they reinforce each other. So I'm pushing a child on the swing. If I push just at the right moment, I can make them go higher and higher and higher with less energy by just matching my frequency with the natural wavelength of their frequency. And theoretically, if you had a frictionless swing, and I've seen such things, you can make the swing go all the way around 360 degrees. So, so that's resonance, aligning my frequency with the frequency of another phenomena. And that's how a singer can shatter a glass, a wine glass, by just hitting that right frequency that resonates. And you can see pictures on YouTube of this, where the rim of the wine glass starts to vibrate and get wilder and wilder, and then it just breaks. Okay, so resonance is really powerful. Well, a physicist told me, and this really just blew my mind when I heard it. He said, the thing about resonance, so I understood resonance, but he said, the thing about resonance is that it attracts. There's an attraction. It not only do these things match up, but they are attracted to each other. So, of course, I've never had this experience, but women tell me, they're living in a dormitory situation, that their periods tend to align, sync up.
Yeah.
Have you ever had that experience?
Yes, with my daughter when she's home on occasion. That has happened.
Yeah. And so that's there's an attraction there. If you put clocks on the same wall, they start, clicking together like these grandfather clocks that have an actual pendulum that keeps the mechanism going. They start going together. And we know that when we are in the company of someone we enjoy,
Yes.
there's a kind of resonant field that we participate in and find pleasure in.
Yes.
So, so then it turns out that if you look at pleasure itself is a wave. We have pleasures that are very active and energetic, like exercise, and they peak, and we might even call it a peak experience. And then after we have, say, a day of skiing, then it goes down into a valley, and we experience that afterglow, that endorphin kind of, we call it an endorphin high, but it's actually an endorphin low.
Right.
And then it gradually comes back to neutral, and we're back to equilibrium, our base level. So as I have investigated this and experienced it in myself and observed it in others, when we get to this very high point of active pleasure, just like the ball that's thrown into the sky, there's that turnaround point. And at the very top of that turnaround point, there's that moment of asis. When that occurs with active pleasure, that is what we call ecstasy. Very intense pleasure, very active pleasure. From that balance point, that turnaround point, the ball starts to drop down. So rather than think of a ball, let's go back to the pendulum. A pendulum, as I said, is always seeking the balance point. But if you look carefully, the pendulum has not just one balance point, it has three. One in the middle, the plumb line. One as it goes to one extreme, back through the plumb line to the other extreme. At those two extremes, at those two turnaround points, you also reach balance. So 3 balance points. The balance point that occurs at the top of the wave of active pleasure is ecstasy. The balance point that occurs at the bottom of what I call passive pleasure after the active exercise, that pleasure that occurs at the bottom is bliss. And when it comes back up to the neutral place, it is what we call equanimity. So those are the 3 gateways to paradise or the asis experience. I know it's a bit complicated, but at the other side, it's fairly straightforward.
Yes, you describe it so well.
Mm.
You also use the yin and yang as an analogy with that. That is a beautiful analogy, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, of course, these ideas and these experiences are really old. This is nothing that I thought up. And the evidence of how old it is really embedded in that yin-yang symbol. So,
yes,
yeah.
You take a lot of concepts though, and you relate them in a very different way, like the way you draw the graphs, and there's a lot of kinesthetic ideas in the book that you give a lot of analogies, a lot of examples, and I'm kind of a visual person, so I really like that about the book, because as you look through it, you've included quite a few illustrations that really support the material, and it's really profound. This you take this line, you make this into this tube, and the idea of taking a linear graph and making it into a 3-dimensional stream, this body, you call it the body stream.
Yes.
That's really profound to take that idea and then make it into a 3-dimensional concept when you're talking about words in a book. It's just really interesting how you bring the ideas. You say that they're timeless and they're, that you didn't think them up, but the way that you present this in the book is very unique.
Well, I thank you for that. That's a lovely compliment. And what I try to do in the book, just like the pleasure prism has these 4 levels, I've attempted to communicate at these 4 different levels, because I know there are people who are more in the red zone and
Right.
Physical and sensual, which is great. So feel this in your body, because that's the ultimate referent. Others of us are a little bit more emotionally inclined, and that's where my stories personal stories and stories of others come in,
Yeah.
to communicate in that way. And then there are others. I have some friends who are really very cerebral, and they can get into the concepts and like, wow, that's so, and I didn't know that, and so forth. And then ultimately, the goal is to embody all three of these and experience and explore for yourself the ossus experience of your day-to-day, moment-to-moment life. And out of that, I think we find what it is we're actually all looking for, which is pleasure.
Well, Dr. Jia, that's very well said. A perfect summary for the book. You did a fantastic job with it. It's something for every spiritual librarian, something you return to. It isn't a novel where you read it once and there's joy in it. It's something that you can come back to it. Yeah, I'm really happy you took the time to write this. I'm curious if you would ever write a journal style book.
What do you mean?
Um, like Ken Wilber and Dr. Abraham Maslow wrote books that were sort of a journal of their personal experience. And having written this first book, I'm curious where you're headed, how you felt about being an author. Would you be interested in writing another book?
Well, I think there is another book coming, and it, when I say it's coming, it's not so much my choosing as it choosing. Like this book, it needed to be written, and for whatever reason, I was selected as a person to write it. And I feel like the same calling is arising with the next book, which is really about turning stones.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, and I think it's coming. So one step at a time.
Yes.
And I really appreciate your careful reading. I mean, your questions tell me that you have read this and reflected on it, and looked in your own life, in your own body, to see the truth of what I was trying to put into words.